All right, gentlemen, we are going to look at pure competition in the long run. So we've hinted at a lot of this while we were studying pure competition in the short run, but we'll now make kind of everything explicit. So really what we're going to be paying attention to is entry and exit, okay? So the main thing is that in the long run, in a purely competitive market, firms can expand or contract, and the expansion or contraction happens really with entry and exit into the industry. Okay, so it's all about entry and exit. When there are profits, firms will enter. When there are losses, firms will leave. And they can do this because there's no cost. That's one of the characteristics of pure competition. So, like I said, we're only going to pay attention to entry and exit. And we're going to assume that all firms have identical costs. Okay, so there's not one firm that's better at it or one firm that hires better employees or is able to purchase their input materials at a different price. We're also going to start off focusing on a constant cost industry. We'll talk later on about increasing and decreasing cost industries, but we're going to begin with constant cost. What this means is that when a firm enters or leaves, it does not affect resource prices. Now, of course, you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't make a ton of sense because if there's one firm and they're hiring, you know, 5 skilled employees, they're going to pay one price. But then when 10 more firms enter and they have to pay more because now they have to hire people away from other businesses, that's true, but that's going to happen in an increasing cost industry, which, like I said, we'll get to later on. So we're going to really be studying our long-run equilibrium position. So what we're going to see is that entry eliminates profit. Okay, so if profit exists, then a firm will enter. And they can do that because there's really no cost to enter. Okay, so since we have no cost to enter into these markets, that's why it's going to happen. And then remember, there's also no cost to leave the markets either. So there's no cost to enter and there's no cost to leave. So when they enter, supply increases and price falls. We remember that just from the very, very beginning. When supply increases, we go from there to there, and price falls. And then obviously the opposite happens down here. Supply decreases and price rises. So here we're going to see it graphically. So this, of course, is our purely competitive market, or in this example, industry. This is our purely competitive firm. Okay, so what you saw is what we just described. When supply goes from S1 to S2, the price falls down from 60 to 50. Notice that we have very different quantities. Okay, so the market is producing 80, 90, or 100,000 units, but an individual firm is only producing 100. But over here, we do notice that our P or that our prices are the same. So the vertical axis has the same price on it. Okay, well, what we're seeing now is we are at price 60. So this is our demand curve, right? This is our average total cost curve. This is our marginal cost curve. And right now, we're earning an economic profit. Okay, so we know that we're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, and that's right here. So we're going to produce slightly more than 100. However, now, and then by the way, this will be our profit line. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Oh boy. Okay, so our profit box is going to be from here to here. Okay, but everybody else in the industry is going to recognize that profit, and then they're going to come in. Oops, that. All right, so they are going to enter the market, and that's going to drive the price down from 60 to 50. Why is it doing that? Okay, so I'm not going to continue drawing on that because it seems to be advancing the slides. Anyway, it drops the price from 60 to 50, and then you'll notice that we have a new line that stretches right through here. Okay, and this new line that's stretching through then becomes our long run equilibrium. Okay, I'm going to try and draw that one more time. So we drop this down here, and that gives us a new line right there. And that takes us down to decreasing our quantity down to 100 as opposed to over here, where this is where we were before at, say, 110. Okay, this was our profit box, but now that's going to go away because the market increased supply when all those new firms entered, chasing this profit. Now let's imagine a different scenario. Let's say that we're losing money. So when there's too many firms, then we wind up down here. We're at $40. Okay, so we're still going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that number is going to be down here. Okay, so our losses are going to be this box right here. We extend that vertical line up, right? So that's the quantity of our loss, or I'm sorry, the total nature of our loss. Now, because there's no reason, there's no cost to leave, there's no reason to stay, so the supply curve is going to shift to the left, and it'll then come along our new, or come along our existing demand curve, okay? And then we go up from here, so our we have a new intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. Our production is going to increase up to 100, and that will eliminate this loss. We'll be back at long run equilibrium. All right, so there's three types of long run supply curves. So we've talked about a constant cost industry, and that's where entry and exit does not affect long run average total cost. This means that resource prices are constant. And it's sort of a special case because if you think about it, resource prices rise when you need to buy more stuff, okay? And that is what we get with an increasing cost industry. Increasing cost industries are the most common, okay? What that means is that the long run supply curve is upsloping, which is what we've always seen. Okay, and then a decreasing cost industry is sort of the opposite of that. In a decreasing cost industry, you actually have falling costs as more things rise. Okay, so increasing cost is where we're going to sort of concentrate because that's the most common. This one's the theoretically easiest, okay, but increasing cost is the most common. Decreasing cost is actually quite rare. So let's look at what that looks like. So here's a constant cost industry. We know that it's constant cost because our supply curve is flat. And basically, just think about this. What it means is as production increases from 100,000 to 110,000, they can buy those 10,000 extra resources without spending anything more. Okay? So there's no increase in cost as they purchase the extra inputs to make 10,000 more units. Likewise, if they make 10,000 fewer units and only create 90,000, then there's no change in cost either. So costs don't go down as things become less scarce. Now let's look at an increasing cost industry. So what this means, and I think that this will make a little bit more sense to you intuitively, if we're making 100,000 units, then we have to spend $50, say, on a particular unit. Now, when we increase to 110,000, the price is going to rise to 55,000 because there are fewer units. Because we need more units, which makes the inputs that we're purchasing more scarce. And once inputs are more scarce, then they cost more money. Okay, so, you know, if I know a couple of you guys work at Waterway, let's say that Waterway opens, you know, say 15 more locations in order to produce a whole bunch more car washes. Well, that means they need a lot more students in order to dry the cars. So right now they're paying, whatever, say $8 an hour for wages. But if they need to convince a whole bunch of students who are currently not interested in working, well, then they're going to have to pay them more. So then those $8 an hour jobs are going to become $9 an hour jobs in order to suck additional people into the labor market. And then the opposite is true as well. If Waterway produces fewer car washes and it doesn't need as many workers, then it could probably afford to drop down to minimum wage. Now, of course, some of those workers would say, well, I'm not working for minimum wage, I'm going to quit. But the people who need the job will stay. Okay? So costs change as output changes, and that's what we see in an increasing cost industry. A decreasing cost industry, on the other hand, means that when more firms enter the market and supply increases, costs actually go down. This is super counterintuitive, but there is an example. The example is the semiconductor industry. So those tech guys out there know that basically memory and chips and all that sort of jazz are built on this idea of semiconductors. So what we've seen is as more and more firms enter the market, they actually experience decreasing costs because of increases in technology. So I think back to the first computer that my family got in like 1986 or something like that, and it cost more than the MacBook. In 1985 dollars, it was more than $2,000. This MacBook that I'm using right now is a little less than $2,000. And suffice it to say, the Apple IIc that we bought in 1986 did not do anywhere near what this MacBook does. Well, the reason for that is because the semiconductor and the sort of computer technology industry is decreasing costs. By continuing to make more, everybody gets better at it, and then the price actually falls. And then the opposite's true too. Okay? So, and once again, we're talking about inputs, and of course the major input a major input in computers is semiconductors. Okay? So, not very common, but like I've told you before, the AP loves these theoretical constructs, so they will oftentimes give you questions and specify what kind of industry they're in. Do not assume that you're in an increasing cost industry or a constant cost industry. Make sure that you pay attention to what it is because it can change your answers. And they do not ask questions in the proportions of industries that are out there in the real world. Okay? So we're almost there. Basically, we're going to talk about efficiency. So purely competitive firms are great for consumers because they will always produce where price, in the long run anyway, they will always produce where price equals minimum average total cost. That means they are always productively efficient. They're also allocatively efficient. They will produce where price equals marginal cost. Okay, so this is the real key here. It's all about price. They're producing where price equals minimum average total cost and price equals marginal cost. Now remember, everybody produces where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But since price equals marginal revenue in a purely competitive firm, that's the magic. Okay? So we can see that here. Here is our market, upsloping supply, downsloping demand. Here's our consumer surplus. Here's our producer surplus. Okay? Now that gives us a price that becomes demand and marginal revenue for a single firm. And our average total cost curve is always going to intersect at its bottom, and then we'll have our marginal cost curve. So this point right here, I think even in class I've called it like a lot of magic happens right there. So price equals marginal cost and minimum ATC. So this is both productively and allocatively efficient, and they are going to earn normal profit. Okay, now likewise, this right here, consumer plus producer surplus, is maximized at this point. There's no lost consumer or producer surplus. Also, purely competitive markets automatically adjust to changes in consumer taste. They automatically adjust to resource supplies and technology. So remember the invisible hand. Okay, the invisible hand is very, very involved here. So if you're in a purely competitive industry and you want to improve, then what you're going to probably concentrate on is improving technology. Okay, so let's say that here you are. Okay, so here's MC, here is ATC, and here is marginal revenue, which equals demand, and that is giving us price. So we could try, if we wanted to, we could try and get out into the market and somehow increase demand from D to D1. That would raise our marginal revenue up here, and that would make us profitable. But of course, that doesn't make a whole ton of sense, and of course, then everybody would flood in the long run, and we would just be back to where we were. But as an entrepreneur, what I'm probably going to do is focus on decreasing my average total cost curve. Okay, so average total cost always intersects ATC at its minimum. Okay, so for a period of time, by increasing my technology or my business acumen or whatever, I can create a temporary situation where I can profit. Now, of course, there's free information, so eventually people are going to figure out what exactly I did, and then the price is going to drop. But there will be a short-run period of profit based on this technological advance, and that's really what entrepreneurs are constantly doing. You can look at the stock trading industry. We have things like E-Trade and Scottrade and all that sort of jazz. Clearly what they did was figure out a way to trade stock more efficiently, which dropped their average total cost and allowed them to profit. This is an example of creative destruction. Okay, so new products, new methods destroy old products and methods. So, Scottrade and E-Trade come along and they'll trade for $7, which makes it very difficult for the old traditional broker firms to continue charging, $15 or $30 per trade. So efficiency gains from entry. So patents, we've talked about these. Patents exist as temporary monopolies, and that means that you are able to, for a certain period of time, in the drug world it's 20 years, you're allowed to behave like a monopoly. Once that patent expires, then the generics come in, supply dramatically increases, and all of a sudden you have a huge price reduction. Therefore, greater consumer surplus. So here's what we can see it looking like graphically. All right, so at P1, you have this tiny amount of consumer surplus, right? So basically, the other thing that we can talk about here is basically here is kind of the initial supply curve, the monopoly supply curve that comes from the patent. Producer surplus, consumer surplus. This isn't perfect, but we go from a consumer surplus area of that to a consumer surplus area of that by the introduction of generic drugs and the increase in supply. That's it, gentlemen. That is the end of chapter